My fiancé asked for a break to explore his feelings for his ex 3 months before our wedding. I ended everything and disappeared completely. So, yes, I just lived through what I'm pretty sure was the fastest relationship implosion in Florida history. And honestly, I'm still processing how someone can be planning a wedding with you one day and asking to be with his ex the next. My name is Avery Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and until a few months ago, I was a software sales director in Tampa with what looked, from the outside, like a perfectly constructed life. 3 years with Daniel Carter. 6 months engaged, a house we bought together 2 years earlier in South Tampa, and a wedding planned for spring. The whole future felt mapped out. Daniel was a freelance graphic designer, creative in the effortless way that made people pay attention to him without even realizing they were doing it. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with new friends, new contacts, and at least one person convinced they had just met someone unusually interesting. He was funny, charming, easy to talk to, the kind of man who made waiters laugh and got people to tell him their life stories within 10 minutes. Up until a few weeks before everything collapsed, I thought I had hit the relationship jackpot. We met at a networking event downtown. My company had sponsored it, one of those professional mixers where everyone claimed to be there for industry connections, but mostly drank cheap wine and exchanged LinkedIn profiles. Daniel was there promoting his design work. He had a small setup at one of the tables, tablet open, scrolling through branding projects he had done for local restaurants and startups. I stopped because one of the logos caught my attention. "Did you design that?" I asked. He looked up and smiled. "Yeah, the client wanted something that felt expensive but still approachable." That line started the whole thing. I work in software sales, which means I spend a lot of time figuring out what companies think they need versus what will actually solve their problems. Daniel approached design in a strangely similar way. We ended up talking far longer than either of us intended. He explained how color changes perception, why certain fonts make people trust a brand more, how small visual details guide the way people experience something without consciously noticing it. I had never really thought about how much psychology sat underneath something that looked so effortless. In return, I told him about long sales cycles, difficult clients, and the strange art of building trust with people who begin every conversation assuming you want something from them. It was one of those rare conversations where time disappears. By the time we finally stopped, it felt like we had skipped past the awkward first layer and landed somewhere real. Our first few dates were just as easy. Daniel would bring his laptop to coffee shops and show me what he was working on: brand concepts, menu redesigns, website layouts. He talked about design the way some people talk about music or architecture, like it was alive. I found it fascinating. I told him about my biggest deals, the clients who stalled for months, the negotiations that came down to reading one tiny shift in someone's tone. We came from different worlds, but somehow they fit together well. He dragged me to gallery openings and small design exhibitions. I dragged him to baseball games and corporate events. He laughed at my bad jokes. I appreciated the way his mind worked. It felt balanced, easy, like we were adding to each other's lives instead of fighting for space inside them. 2 years into dating, we bought a house together. It was a small place in South Tampa. 3 bedrooms, a modest backyard, and walking distance from a handful of restaurants and coffee shops we both liked. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt like the kind of home people grow into. We furnished it slowly over time, not in a stressful way, more like an ongoing project we built together. Daniel wanted a deep charcoal accent wall in the living room. I thought it would make the space feel too dark. We argued about shades for days, and eventually compromised on something slightly lighter. When the painters finished, he stood there staring at the wall like he had personally delivered a masterpiece. "See," he said, "trust the designer." He was right. It looked incredible. One of my favorite memories from that time was the day we got the keys. The house was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, just sunlight pouring across the hardwood floors. We sat on the floor in the middle of the living room with a cheap bottle of champagne we had grabbed on the way over. We didn't even have glasses yet, so we drank out of coffee mugs. Daniel leaned back against the wall, looked around the room, and smiled. "This is ours," he said. The way he looked at me in that moment made everything feel settled in the best possible way. Safe, real, permanent. I remember thinking very clearly, I'm going to marry this man. About a year and a half later, Daniel proposed. He took me to a dinner downtown, then suggested we walk through one of my favorite spots nearby, a quiet little park with old brick paths and enough trees to make the city feel temporarily far away. I thought it was just a nice evening out. Instead, halfway through the walk, he stopped, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a ring. For a second, I just stared at him. Daniel, who was usually smooth in every situation, looked almost nervous. Genuinely nervous. "Avery," he said, "I know I joke through almost everything, but I'm serious about you. I'm serious about us. I don't want to keep building a life that only sounds like forever. I want it to be forever." Then he got down on one knee. I started crying before he even finished the question. "Yes," I said. He laughed in relief. "I haven't actually asked yet." "Yes, anyway," I told him. That part at least had felt simple, certain, beautiful. The next few months disappeared into wedding planning. The wedding was scheduled for April. Daniel was completely in his element. He designed the invitations himself, built color palettes, created mood boards, and talked endlessly about lighting, table settings, and the visual flow of the venue. Watching him work was honestly impressive. He had an instinct for how 100 tiny details would come together into something polished and memorable. Meanwhile, I mostly stayed out of his way and paid vendors on time. Life felt stable, safe, like we were building something solid. But there were little things I ignored. Daniel had always been social. His Instagram was constantly active. Friends, old classmates, clients, people commenting on everything he posted. One name showed up more than the others. Olivia, his ex from college, a personal trainer, attractive in the polished, permanently camera-ready way. Some people seemed to manage as a full-time condition. Daniel had mentioned her before, but never in a way that made me concerned. "She was fun," he once told me, "but way too immature for anything serious." I didn't think much about it until one Saturday morning. I was making breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Just a quiet, ordinary morning in the kitchen of the house where I thought we were preparing for marriage. Daniel walked in, sat at the table, and I knew immediately something was wrong. He looked tense, not angry, not sad, just deeply uncomfortable. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. I set the spatula down. "Okay." He hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking a lot about us, about getting married." My stomach tightened. "And?" He took a breath. "I think we should take a break." For a moment, I assumed he meant wedding stress. Planning a wedding can make sane people say bizarre things. So I asked carefully, "What kind of break are we talking about?" He looked down at the table, then back at me. Olivia reached out to me. That name landed in the room like broken glass. "My ex," he added quietly. "I know who Olivia is," I said. He nodded. "She's been thinking about me, and honestly, I've been thinking about her too." I stared at him, waiting for the rest, waiting for the sentence to turn into something less awful than it sounded. It didn't. "I think before we get married," Daniel said slowly, "I should explore those feelings." The kitchen went completely silent. My brain kept trying to reframe what he had just said, to make it mean something else, something less humiliating. But there was no softer interpretation available. He was asking for a pause on our engagement so he could see if he still had feelings for his ex-girlfriend. I heard myself say, much calmer than I felt, "You want to take a break from our engagement so you can explore things with your ex?" Daniel immediately shook his head. "It's not just about sex, Avery." That somehow made it worse. The smell of burnt toast was rising behind me. The coffee maker was still hissing. Morning light still cut across the counter. Everything ordinary kept going, while the man I was supposed to marry calmly explained that he needed time to determine whether another woman still mattered more to him than I did. I turned off the stove because I suddenly couldn't stand the sound of anything normal continuing in that moment. Then I looked at him again. "Explain it to me." Daniel rubbed his hands together. "Olivia messaged me a couple of weeks ago." A couple of weeks. Not that morning. Not the night before. Not during some spontaneous emotional spiral. A couple of weeks ago. Meaning, he had already been living inside this conversation long before he decided to invite me into it. "She reached out of nowhere," he said. "At first it was casual, just catching up." "And you answered." He looked away. "Yes." "Did you tell her you were engaged?" "Yes, of course." I laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Of course?" "Avery, don't do that." "Don't do what?" "React like a woman whose fiancé is asking for permission to audition another relationship before the wedding?" His jaw tightened. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He leaned forward, trying to sound calm and reasonable. "It brought up feelings I thought were finished. And before we get married, before we make a permanent commitment, I need to be completely sure." There it was. Completely sure. As if our 3 years together had been some extended trial version. As if the house, the ring, the deposits, the plans, the families, the promises, all of it still hadn't given him enough information. I folded my arms across my chest because suddenly I felt cold. And what exactly does being completely sure involve? He hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the answer itself. I need space, he said. Time to sort out what I'm feeling. With Olivia. Yes, I nodded once. And during this time, what exactly am I supposed to do? His expression softened, and somehow that made everything worse. I'm not asking you to disappear, he said. I'm asking you to give me room to think. Maybe this is healthy. Maybe space before marriage is what we both need. I just looked at him. He kept going, mistaking my silence for openness. We've been moving so fast. The house, the engagement, the wedding planning. 3 years is fast? You know what I mean. No, I said. Actually, I don't. He exhaled hard. Avery, I'm trying to be honest with you instead of doing something worse behind your back. That landed like a slap. So I was supposed to be grateful. Grateful that he was requesting permission before humiliating me instead of humiliating me in secret. I walked to the sink and gripped the edge of the counter. And that was when I understood something I didn't want to understand. Daniel was not coming to me confused. He was coming to me with a plan. He had already thought it through, already justified it to himself, already decided it was fair. What he wanted from me was not perspective. It was cooperation. He wanted me to stand politely to the side while he checked whether his past still appealed to him more than the life we had built together. I turned back around. How long? He blinked. What? How long is this break supposed to last? He hesitated. Maybe a month, 2 at most. A month, maybe 2. Long enough to reopen a door. Long enough to test the chemistry. Long enough to let me sit in our house surrounded by wedding plans while he figured out whether I was actually the woman he wanted. And in this 1 to 2 month emotional field trip, I said, my voice terrifyingly steady, I'm supposed to do what? Wait? Daniel had the decency to look uncomfortable. I'm asking you to think too, he said, about us, about whether we're doing this for the right reasons. That was the moment something inside me went still. Not shattered, still. Because I had felt the shape of this before, years earlier in a different relationship. I had once been the stable option, the dependable woman. Someone kept close while deciding whether excitement mattered more than loyalty. I had promised myself I would never live like that again. Never wait in the wings while someone compared me to someone else. The moment a person asks you to wait while they figure out whether they want you, they have already answered the question. Daniel was still talking about honesty, fear, uncertainty, how maybe this would make our marriage stronger in the end, but I barely heard him. I only heard the truth underneath it. He was not certain about me. And a man who is not certain about you before the wedding does not magically become safe after it. I walked back toward the table. Daniel looked up at me with this brief, impossible flicker of hope, like maybe he thought I was about to negotiate boundaries for his little experiment. Instead, I said no. His brows pulled together. No what? No breaks. He stared at me. We are either getting married, I said, or we are not. You do not get to put me on hold while you reconnect with your ex-girlfriend. His face changed instantly. From uncertainty to alarm. Avery, that's not fair. I almost smiled. Not cruel, not painful, not humiliating. Unfair. Asking me to wait while you explore another woman is unfair, I said. Ending this is a consequence. He stood up, agitation rising. You're twisting what I'm saying. Am I? Yes, I'm trying to do the right thing. No, Daniel, you're trying to do the selfish thing cleanly. He ran a hand through his hair. I love you. I nodded. I'm sure some version of you believes that. His expression hardened. That's cruel. No, cruel is building a wedding with me while keeping emotional space open for someone else. He started crying then, real tears. And if you've never watched someone break your heart while crying, like they are the one being hurt, it is one of the most disorienting things in the world. He said he didn't want to lose me. He said Olivia had brought up unresolved feelings. He said marriage felt huge and permanent, and he needed to know he wasn't making a mistake. He said he was being brave by telling me before doing anything physical. He said if I loved him, I would understand. That line finished it. If I loved him, I would understand. No. If I had less self-respect, I would participate. That was different. I slipped my engagement ring off slowly. Daniel stopped talking mid-sentence. His eyes fixed on my hand. Avery? I set the ring gently on the kitchen table between us. The click it made was tiny, but it felt louder than anything else in that house. The engagement is over, I said. His face drained of color. You can't be serious. I held his gaze. I'm completely serious. Daniel stood there staring at the ring on the table like the ground had suddenly disappeared under his feet. Avery, wait. But something inside me had already shifted. Not rage, not hysteria, just clarity. The kind that comes when a situation finally reveals exactly what it is. You asked me to wait while you figure out if you want another woman, I said calmly. I'm not doing that. That's not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. He ran his hands through his hair, pacing now. You're overreacting. No, I said quietly. I'm responding. That was the last real conversation we had in that house. Daniel left later that afternoon and stayed with a friend for the night. I spent the evening canceling vendors and staring at the calendar on the kitchen wall where tasting appointments and dress fittings were still scribbled in neat blue ink. By the time I went to sleep, the decision had already been made. The engagement wasn't the only thing ending. The house was too. The next morning, I called Daniel. We need to talk about the house. He sounded exhausted. What about it? We should sell. There was a long silence. Then he said something I didn't expect. Yeah. That one word told me everything about how real the situation had become. Because Daniel loved that house. But even he knew the truth. Once the engagement ended, the life attached to it ended too. We met with a realtor 2 days later and agreed to list the property and split the proceeds after paying off the mortgage. It was strange how quickly logistics replaced emotion. Paperwork, documents, numbers, things that could be organized. Unlike the rest of it. Sebastian came down from Orlando to help me pack. He walked into the living room, looked at the half-filled boxes and said, "So we're really doing this?" "Yes." "Good." My brother has never believed in pretending bad situations are acceptable. We packed for hours. Clothes first, then books, then kitchen cabinets. At one point, Sebastian held up a ceramic bowl Daniel had bought during a design trip to Miami. "Keep?" I looked at it for a moment, then shook my head. "No." That became the rhythm of the week. Keep, donate, store, let go. Daniel came by a few times during those days to collect some of his things. Each conversation was shorter than the last. The first time he tried to explain himself again. The second time he tried to apologize. The third time he simply packed quietly and left. By the end of the week, the house felt hollow. Not sad, just empty. The realtor called the following Monday. "We have an offer," she said. It was slightly below market value, but clean and fast. A couple relocating from Atlanta wanted to close quickly. I accepted. Not because it was the best price, because it was the cleanest exit. By the time closing day arrived, the house looked almost exactly like it had the day we bought it. Bare floors, sunlight through the windows, echoing rooms. Except this time, the future wasn't waiting inside. It was somewhere else entirely. 2 days later, I loaded the last of my belongings into my car and started driving west. Austin had been an open sales territory for months. When my boss heard I was willing to relocate, he approved the transfer almost immediately. The highway out of Florida stretched for miles. At first, the drive felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life from outside. Hours later, somewhere along the Gulf Coast, my phone started vibrating across the passenger seat. Daniel, call after call, voicemail after voicemail. The first message sounded confused. "Avery, why is there a sold sign in the yard?" The second sounded worried. "We need to talk about this." The third sounded panicked. "I didn't realize you were serious." That part made me laugh quietly to myself, because he hadn't believed me, even after the ring, even after the boxes, even after the realtor. Some part of him had assumed I would calm down eventually, and everything would go back to normal. By the time I reached Mississippi, I turned the phone off. Some conversations don't need to continue. 3 days later, I arrived in Austin. The apartment I rented downtown wasn't huge, but it had something the house in Tampa didn't anymore. Peace, clean white walls, large windows, a balcony overlooking the city skyline. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling pressure in my chest. Sebastian stayed behind in Florida to handle the final paperwork and closing logistics. A week later, he called. "You'll appreciate this," he said. "What happened?" "Daniel showed up at the house the day the new owners moved in." "And?" "He brought Olivia." "Of course he did." Sebastian chuckled. "You should have seen his face when the buyers opened the door." Apparently, Daniel had believed the listing was temporary, some kind of dramatic gesture meant to scare him. Instead, he arrived to find strangers carrying furniture inside what used to be our living room. "What did Olivia do?" I asked. "Looked uncomfortable," Sebastian said, like she realized the game had consequences. Apparently, she didn't stay long. 2 weeks later, Daniel called Sebastian, asking if he knew where I had moved. My brother told him the truth. No idea. Which technically wasn't a lie. By then, I had already built a small life in Austin that had nothing to do with Tampa. Daniel did eventually figure out where I was. Not through Sebastian. Through LinkedIn. My company announced my promotion and relocation publicly a few months after I moved. Apparently that was enough. 3 months after the breakup, I came back from a morning run and saw someone sitting on the steps outside my apartment building. At first, I thought it was another resident. Then the man stood up. Daniel. He looked thinner than I remembered. Tired. like the last few months had not been kind to him. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he said the inevitable words. "We need to talk." I sighed. "No, we don't. Avery, please." People were walking dogs nearby. A couple neighbors were leaving for work. I didn't want a scene. "Fine," I said finally. Inside, my apartment felt brighter than the house in Tampa ever had. Minimal furniture, simple layout, a space that belonged only to me. Daniel looked around slowly. "This is nice." I dropped my keys on the counter. "What do you want?" "I want to fix this." I shook my head. "There's nothing to fix." I made a mistake. "The biggest mistake of my life," he added quickly. I didn't respond, because that part wasn't surprising. He kept talking. "Olivia convinced me I might be settling," he said. "She kept telling me I'd regret not exploring what could have been." "And that worked?" I was scared. "Of committing?" "Yes." I leaned against the counter. "What happened with Olivia?" His expression tightened. "It lasted 2 weeks." 2 weeks. 3 years. A house. A wedding. All of it destroyed in 14 days. "She lost interest," he admitted quietly. "Of course she did." Daniel rubbed his face. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said, "trying to understand why I sabotage things when they get serious." "That's probably a good idea." "I miss you." I didn't answer. "I miss our life," he said. "You miss security," I replied. "That's not fair." "It's accurate." He stepped closer. "I love you." I studied him for a moment. "You love the life we had," I said. "That life included you." "Yes," I said calmly, "but that's not the same thing." Desperation crept into his voice. "I'll move here." "That's not necessary." "I'll do therapy, counseling, whatever you want. You can rebuild a house." "You can't rebuild certainty." "I don't want what we had," I said. Daniel froze. "What?" "I don't want it back." "But we were happy." "No," I said gently. "You were comfortable." Silence filled the room. Eventually, he realized nothing he said was changing anything. When he finally stood up to leave, he looked smaller somehow. "I really did love you," he said quietly. "I know." He waited like he expected something more. There wasn't. After he left, I stepped onto the balcony and watched his car disappear down the street. I waited for regret, for doubt, for something. Instead, there was only relief, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. Daniel showed me exactly who he was when commitment became real. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. A year has passed since that morning in our kitchen. A year since the ring hit the table. A year since I drove out of Florida. Austin turned out to be exactly what I needed. The tech market here is bigger, faster, more competitive than Tampa ever was. Within 6 months, I was closing contracts nearly twice the size of anything I handled before. 9 months after relocating, my boss promoted me to regional sales director, overseeing Texas and Louisiana. Life felt full again. Morning runs along Lady Bird Lake. Weekend food trucks and outdoor markets. A city full of people building things instead of clinging to the past. 6 months after moving, I attended another networking event downtown. I was standing near the bar reviewing emails when a voice beside me said, "Software sales, right?" I looked up. The man next to me had an easy confidence that didn't need to prove itself. "How did you guess?" I asked. "You've been reading that email thread for 3 minutes with the exact expression every sales director makes when a client tries to renegotiate." I laughed. His name was Ryan Cole, marketing director at a fast-growing tech startup. We ended up talking the entire evening. Ryan was different from Daniel in ways that became obvious almost immediately. He didn't chase attention. He didn't need validation from every room he walked into. He was simply certain. When I eventually told him about the breakup, his reaction was blunt. "Good." I raised an eyebrow. "That's harsh." "It's realistic," he said. "The wrong person leaving your life makes room for the right one." We've been together for 6 months now. We're talking about moving in together soon. His lease ends this summer, and my apartment has room for both of us. The difference between this relationship and my last one is simple. With Daniel, I always felt like I had to prove my value. With Ryan, I never wonder where I stand. Because when someone is certain about you, you don't spend your time trying to convince them. Daniel did send one final message. It arrived on what would have been our wedding day. "I still think about you every day. I hope you're happy." I read it. Then I blocked the number. Through mutual friends, I've heard pieces of what his life looks like now. Several short relationships, none lasting very long. Apparently, one woman he dated eventually asked him a question that ended things quickly. "If things get serious with us," she said, "are you going to suddenly need space again?" Reputations travel fast in cities like Tampa. Meanwhile, my life kept moving forward. New job, new city, new relationship, new future. Sometimes I think back to that quiet morning in the kitchen, Daniel sitting at the table, telling me he needed time to explore his feelings. At the time, it felt like the worst moment of my life. But looking back now, it was the moment everything finally started to make sense. Because when someone asks you to wait while they figure out whether they want you, they've already given you the answer. And the right person never needs time to compare options. They just know.